The Archon's silver eyes remained fixed, cold and unyielding as glacial ice. Kalen Vance didn't flinch, didn't argue, and didn't beg. He simply offered a single, sharp nod of his head, a clinical acknowledgement of her contempt, and turned his back. He walked toward the massive obsidian doors as the galaxy held its collective breath. If you want to witness how a single step can shift the weight of empires, subscribe now and join our journey through the stars. Now let's see how the silence began. 6 hours earlier, Kalen had spent 20 minutes meticulously adjusting his formal high-collared tunic in the reflection of a dull bulkhead. The Zenith Hub was a sprawling masterwork of crystalline architecture and gravity-defying spires, a far cry from the cramped, functional corridors of the Terran vessels. The POV anchor for this chronicle, a junior protocol droid adjutant named Eris, biological in essence but cybernetic in function, watched the human diplomat from the shadows of the docking bay. Eris noted the way Kalen's fingers lingered on the fabric of his sleeve, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle. To Eris, the human appeared like a soft-shelled organism entering a reef of predators. Beside Kalen stood Mira Thorne. Her gaze was constant, scanning the rafters and the shimmering energy shields of the hub. They moved through the diverse alien crowd, a sea of bioluminescent scales, multi-jointed limbs, and hovering atmospheric suits. Eris followed 3 paces behind, recording the sensory data. The smell of heavy ammonia from the Xylanth delegation, the rhythmic clicking of the mantiskin, and the oppressive, hum-like vibration of the hub's core. Terra was the newcomer, a species whose history was a mere heartbeat compared to the eons recorded in the Luminary archives. Eris observed the other species parting for them, not out of respect, but with a curiosity usually reserved for a new strain of bacteria. In the Great Hall, the atmosphere shifted. The light dimmed to a regal violet as Archon Celine Vane descended from the high dais. She was a vision of terrifying symmetry, her skin the color of starlight, draped in robes that seemed to be woven from captured nebulae. Kalen stepped forward, his posture open. He reached out, his hand extended in the universal Terran gesture of peace and parity. Eris recorded the microfluctuations in the room's temperature as Celine stopped 3 feet away. She didn't look at the hand. She looked through Kalen, her lip curling in a display of practiced, ancient superiority. "We did not invite the livestock to the table," Celine's voice echoed, amplified by the hub's resonance chambers. "We expected a representative, not a civilized ape playing at statesmanship." The insult hit the room like a physical shock. The mantiskin froze. The Xylanth's lights dimmed to a wary charcoal gray. Eris watched Kalen's extended hand. It didn't shake. It didn't drop immediately. For 3 seconds, the human let the rejection hang in the air like a terminal diagnosis. It was in this vacuum of sound that the true nature of Earth was first revealed to the hegemony. Kalen didn't flush red with anger. He didn't stammer an apology for his existence. He simply retracted the hand and tucked it behind his back. 10,000 years of history collapsed in the silence of a single turned heel, Kalen whispered, loud enough only for those closest to hear. The weight of the galaxy's gaze is a heavy thing to carry, but it's even heavier when you're the one watching it all fall apart. If you're ready to see what happens when the small voices start to whisper back, subscribe and don't miss the next transmission. Eris followed as the Terran delegation pivoted as one. There was no haste in their retreat, only a rhythmic, synchronized gait that suggested they were leaving because the room had become uninteresting. As they neared the exit, Eris looked back. The Archon remained on the dais, but her composure had a hairline fracture. She was looking at the empty space where the apes had stood, and for the first time in her recorded reign, she looked uncertain. The other species in the hall, the smaller ones, the ones who had lived under the luminary shadow for centuries, were not looking at the Archon. They were watching the doors. "Power is the ability to command," Kalen said to Mira as they reached the atmospheric lock of their ship, the Aegis 7. "But strength is the wisdom to walk away." Inside the ship, the transition was jarring. The opulence of the hub was replaced by the utilitarian gray of Terran steel and the smell of recycled air and ozone-scrubbed electronics. Kalen sat in the commander's chair, his eyes fixed on the view screen showing the hub's exterior. "We wait," he commanded. Eris monitored the long-range sensors. For 2 hours, nothing but the background radiation of the sector filled the logs. Then, a jagged spike of energy cut through the silence. A high-priority distress signal, encrypted with Luminary royal codes, began to bleed through the emergency frequencies. The jagged spike on the terminal was a scream in a silent room. Eris watched the telemetry bloom across the Aegis 7's tactical display, a chaotic spray of heat signatures and kinetic impacts 5,000 kilometers out. A Luminary heavy transport, gilded and sluggish, was being torn open by 3 pirate interceptors, sleek, jagged things that moved like silver needles through silk. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a civilization built on ivory towers meets a crew forged in the dark, subscribe and witness the dance. We're going in. The bridge of the Aegis 7 transformed. The soft diplomatic lighting died, replaced by the harsh, rhythmic amber of combat readiness. Kalen Vance didn't look like a man who had been insulted an hour ago. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the universe to stop talking. "Burn the stabilizers," Kalen commanded, his voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that Eris recorded as command tier. "Intercept trajectory. Mira, take the boarding party. We don't just stop them. We show them how we dance." Eris felt the deck plates groan. To a Luminary, space was a vacuum to be traversed with grace. To a human, it was a medium to be conquered. The Aegis 7 didn't glide. It punched through the void, its engines roaring with a feral intensity that vibrated through Eris's sensory dampeners. They closed the gap in minutes, a feat of tactical precision the Luminary sensors likely couldn't even process. The pirate vessels were focused on the transport's primary hull, their boarding saws throwing off sparks that looked like dying stars. They never saw the Terran ship coming. Kalen didn't use the main cannons. He used the ship itself as a shield, sliding the Aegis 7 between the predators and their prey with a scream of metal on metal. "They called us apes," Myra's voice crackled over the comms, breathless as she strapped into her mag boots. "Let's show them the jungle." Eris watched the remote feed from Myra's helmet. The boarding was a blur of controlled violence. Where the Luminary fought with long-range energy beams and rigid formations, the Terrans moved with a terrifying, fluid chaos. They breached the transport's airlock using localized explosive shunts, drifting through zero-G with a grace that felt predatory. Inside the transport, the Luminary nobles were huddled in the center of the Grand Promenade, their iridescent skin pale with terror. The pirates were closing in, weapons leveled, until the bulkhead behind them ceased to exist. Mira led the charge through a curtain of fire and debris. She didn't fire blindly. She moved with a kinetic economy, disabling the pirates with blunt force and precision stun rounds. It was over in 84 seconds. Eris recorded the silence that followed. The Luminary transport was a wreck of shattered crystal and flickering lights. In the center of the debris stood Mira, her visor cracked, her breathing heavy. She reached down toward a fallen Luminary child who was staring up at her with wide, obsidian eyes. Mira didn't speak. She just offered a hand, the same gesture Kalen had been denied. The child took it, and now, back at the Zenith hub, the air felt different. The obsidian doors remained shut, but the silence wasn't cold anymore. It was expectant. The Aegis 7 had returned, docked not as a visitor, but as a savior. Kalen Vance stood once more in the center of the Great Hall. His tunic was scorched, and a thin line of red ran down his cheek from a stray fragment. He didn't wait for an introduction. Archon Celine Vane descended the dais, but she didn't walk with the same rehearsed superiority. Her steps were heavy, measured. She stopped inches from him. The entire diplomatic corps of the galaxy leaned in. Celine looked at the blood on his face, then at the survivors standing behind him, guarded by Terran soldiers who looked like they were made of granite. The Archon didn't speak to the room. She spoke only to Kalen. "I mistook silence for weakness," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in centuries. "And I mistook your kindness for a lack of teeth." She reached out. Her hand was trembling, a biological tell Eris had never seen in a Luminary of her rank. She didn't demand. She offered. Kalen took the hand. He didn't squeeze too hard, nor did he let go too quickly. He held it with the steady, quiet strength of a species that had survived its own extinction a dozen times over. Years later, Eris stood in the shadow of a new monument on the hub's central plaza. It was a simple thing of Terran steel and luminary crystal. It depicted two hands meeting in the center of a star. The alliance had grown into something the galaxy had never seen, not a hierarchy of fear, but a partnership of equals. Selene, now Empress, walked the halls with a dignity that was no longer a mask, but a reflection of the lessons she'd learned from the primitive newcomers. Eris watched as Kalen Vance, older now and retired from the front lines, walked past the monument. He didn't stop to admire the statue. He simply glanced at his own hand, then reached out to steady a young luminary clerk who had tripped on the uneven pavement. The gesture was reflexive, quiet, and carried the weight of a peace that had been earned in the fire. Does true strength require a witness, or is it most powerful when the doors are closed? Subscribe to find out what we uncover in tomorrow's archive.